Thank you everyone for coming to this event. My name is Owen Hopkins. It's my pleasure to welcome you to This is Multiform, an event that is hosted by Newcastle University School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape. This event marks the publication of Multiform, Architecture in an Age of Transition, which is a special edition of Architectural Design magazine edited by myself and Erin McKellar, Assistant Curator at the Soho Museum in London. In the issue, we describe multiform as a new and vital sensibility emerging in contemporary architecture and design, one that reflects the present moment of profound political, economic, and environmental change. And we are really delighted this evening to welcome a number of contributors to the issue who we've invited to reflect on what multiform means to them and how it relates to their work. Multiform quite literally takes multiple forms. So rather than us as editors saying this is multiform, we are turning it over to our contributors, who will instead offer a snapshot of multiform in terms of its inherent multiplicity, hybridity, and its pluralism. But to set the scene, we thought it would be useful to briefly introduce some of multiform's parents, we are calling them, the people, events, ideas, technologies, and trends that have given rise to it and have helped shape it. So Erin's going to kick off. We have 8 parents, and we're going to take it in turns to very briefly introduce them. So Erin, it's going to kick things off.
Thank you. So I'm so pleased to see all of you tonight, and we're going to be sort of going through 8 of these sort of moments. The first of them is on your screen right now. This is 2008, the collapse of Lehman Brothers. So there are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen, as Vladimir Ilyich Lenin probably did not say. On the morning of 15th September 2008, the world woke up to the news that Lehman Brothers was filing for bankruptcy. This is what we refer to as a 1973 moment, a shock which rocked the political economic system to its core. And we know that sort of this revealed cracks, and those cracks have now sort of been papered over, but it inaugurated a transition that we're in the midst of. And I think that this transition is very much the sort of spirit of multiform.
Yeah. So now going from the sort of macro political economic situation to an architectural one, in Learning from Las Vegas, Venturi, Scott Brown, and Eisenhower said, quote, "Architects are out of the habit of looking non-judgmentally at the environment because orthodox modern architecture is progressive. It is dissatisfied with existing conditions. Modern architecture has been anything but permissive. Architects have preferred to change the existing environment rather than enhance what is there. We look backward at history and tradition to go forward. We can look downward to go upward, and withholding judgment may be used as a tool to make later judgment more sensitive." Today, the lessons of Learning from Las Vegas have, I think, been forgotten, and multiform is part of the corrective to that, going against the polite, dull, conservative, dressed up as progressive architecture of the present, and revealing how much contemporary architectural culture has elevated itself from everyday life and the concerns of people. Erin.
So the existence of the internet means that architects can now access a source book that broadly reaches across space and time. Social media has become a layered way of disseminating information, which is inherently multimedia. Multiform is also multimedia. Text, image, video, sound are right there, making it possible to see, but also by proxy experience architecture. This, we think, runs counter to the Jenksian notion of style, which was always dependent on print media. And the nature of social media and the larger internet means that anyone can be publishing ideas about architecture at any time. So it sort of gets to the heart of multiform as made up of multiple people.
Okay, Postmodernism is now 50 years old, which is the same age modernism was when postmodernism first arose. So modernism itself is now 100 years old. And postmodernism has therefore become historicized. We're able to look at it with fresh eyes, without the prejudice that marked the backlash against its stylistic manifestations in the 90s, in the 2000s, indeed still in the present. And this was the underlying message of the exhibition that we organized at Sir John Soane's Museum in 2018, which looked at the early radical moment, as we called it, of postmodernism in British architecture.
In the intro to the 80 issue, we posit that FAT are the sort of John the Baptists of multiform. They blazed a trail by exposing how neo-modernism replaced moral or ideological purity with an aesthetic one. After disbanding in 2013, FAT returned for a special issue of the Architect's Journal entitled The Death and Life of the Architect, which explored how resurrection, zombification, and other forms of design afterlives are essential to forming new architectural ideas. In those pages, co-director Charles Holland describes, quote, "The death and life of the architect marks various ends, fictional, architectural, professional, but it also suggests new beginnings, ways to make architecture meaningful and important again," end quote. And it is, I think it's Multiform, which reflects very much these new beginnings.
And of course, the members of FAT themselves are part of those new beginnings too. And I think we may have one of them. In fact, we may have Charles actually in the audience. So hi, Charles. We're living at a moment of environmental crisis in which architecture is decisively implicated. Some say that it's implicated so deeply that we must stop building at all. And while architecture needs to work within its material limits, Multiform shows this does not need to limit its cultural ones. And this project by Studio Mutt for Runcorn, I think, bears this out very dramatically.
On 12th December 1962, John F. Kennedy exclaimed, "We choose to go to the moon." This was an almost inconceivable challenge, which he laid down in a speech at Rice University. And it was met by the decade's end, as he demanded, not by sort of slick spaceships that had been imagined in sci-fi and had been created on screen in films, but instead through the triumph of an ad hoc design, which was figured by the unmistakable form of the Apollo lunar module. So we don't think that Charles Jenks mentions the lunar module specifically in ad hocism, but it makes a startling analog to what he says, which is ad hocism makes visible the complex workings of the environment. Instead of an homogeneous surface which smooths over all distinctions and difficulties, it looks to the intractable problem as the source of supreme expression. From the confrontation of diverse subsystems, it drags an art of jagged, articulated cataclysms that shout out the problems from every corner. Multiform, we posit, is a similar celebration of the complexity of the world.
And the final parent, so to speak, instead of this celebration of complexity, this is what architecture, or some aspects of architecture, are in danger of becoming. This is a photo I took in 2019, a little bit of, I guess, community consultation in Kennington Park in London, where the community were being offered 5 different shades of brown brick as an option to clad a new building that was being constructed because of the Northern Line extension there. It's often said that architecture is the manifestation of the society that created it, its ideals, its values, and its power structures. And by implication, architecture is a reflection of these external ideas and agendas. But while it certainly can be passive and appropriated and instrumentalized, architecture also has the potential to be active, dynamic, and inspiring. And if populist politics that in many ways define our present moment are tending towards a monocultural architecture and urbanism, then it stands to reason that a built environment that allows room for different forms, ideas, and agendas may itself foster a far more pluralistic form of politics. So in short, this stuff matters. So that's it from Erin and I, and it's now over to the contributors to the AD, who we've each given 5 minutes, and we'll because we have a lot of speakers, a lot of contributors, we're going to be try to be relatively strict on time, but it's over to them now to reflect on what multiform means to them and how it may or may not figure in their work. And I'm really pleased to welcome our first speaker, which is Leira Samovic Alfala Atelier. Leira, over to you, and do take over the screen if you wish.
So hello, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. I will share my screen. So I will basically try to summarize maybe our contribution to the publication in 5 points. And the title that we gave to it was Aiming for Personality, an exercise of continuous improvisation. And as a start, well, the office is it's many things, and it has many sides and many parts, and postmodernist side is just one of them. And I would say that our enthusiasm and our geeky brain that is full of exotic references constantly has to confront let's say, the very banal context, stubborn clients, and dull municipalities. And therefore, our architecture kind of happens at this intersection of our ambition and of our limitations. And so there is, of course, a long list of our favorite architects, our favorite rooms, plans, facades, and buildings that becomes, I would say, a common ground of the office. It is our basic language, and we understand each other through those references. And we collect traces, fragments, and elements in order to kind of reassemble them back here, and we are constantly trying to update our vocabulary. So therefore, architecture can probably be described as divided and fragmented with an emphasis on those elements. And in our practice, we move towards a pluralistic language, and we see this language as kind of as an arrangement of many metaphors, tropes, turns and masks, and we are immensely interested in form and composition, which is kind of always very hard to justify. So then those various elements, they are expressed through the active use of color in order to distinguish between them. There is also a passion for all kinds of patterns and facades that become masks or billboards. So in the end, the projects they result from kind of precisely this confluence of oppositions, I would say. They're both serious and playful, and yeah. So our architecture is in the end kind of this continuously renewed improvisation on all kinds of themes that come from every possible direction. And this is it. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. Fascinating and incredibly succinct. Next, we have Graham Byrne, James Crawford, and Alexander Turner of Studio Mutt. So over to you three.
Hello, sorry, I'm the keeper of the slides, so I will share this now. And there's all the slides. Got that?
Yeah, okay. Okay, so we're Studio Mutt, and our contribution to Multiform is called Nothing New. It talks about the use of sampling and remixing in architecture. And we mean, the title Nothing New applies on a number of levels, really. So nothing new in terms of the method. So I think sampling and remixing, terms usually used in making music, are processes used by many of our contemporaries and many of our inspirations from years gone by, and many people have already wrote about this. And nothing new in terms of the end product. So using remixing as a way of working that splices together and layers existing things to create something new, rather than fetishizing the whole idea of the new. An approach that seems to result in a pseudo new aesthetic or result in a kind of novelty, I think. So in part, we were kind of interested to talk about why we were drawn to work that was that very consciously referenced other work and placed itself as part of a lineage of architecture rather than striving for some sort of pristine originality. And also how, like in music, the sample can appear as something that is once familiar and also slightly strange at the same time. So we think sampling relates to the whole idea of multiform, because multiform doesn't seem to be a style, but more a kind of sensibility. It seems to be about working with what actually exists in a specific context and time, physically, culturally, politically. And it's perhaps born from working in the context of this of a kind of dwindling neoliberal system that hasn't got this grand narrative to drive a singular style. Or perhaps it comes from the accessibility of the internet, which has resulted in architects' source books, pattern books exploding with references, which are ripe and readily accessible for cutting into new work. And that's also resulted in no dominant media dictating what style is good or bad. So it's kind of allowed this plurality, which I think can be achieved through referencing and sampling. So I'll hand over to Alex now, who's going to flick through a few of our projects which we think most obvious show this.
Yeah, so yeah, as kind of James has said, it really is it's quite personal to Mutt. And I guess, as we've already kind of referenced music, to quote Louis Armstrong, "You blows who you is," in a way. So this is how we work within the office. Many artists and architects, as we actually just heard from Fala there, are also working in this way, and that we think is really great. But I guess why we do it and why we think it's good is that ultimately the conversations that we have in our studio are about architecture's potential to tell stories and to hold memories. And a lot of the time those stories start with taking the world as it exists. So here at the Sohn Museum, the main sample was a piece of text that you can see on the left-hand side there, which we discovered that was written by Sohn himself. And the project brings together and brings to life 4 characters, which were described by him in a dark kind of Dear Diary confession piece. Apart from the description, each of the characters also sampled from the rich treasures that are within the museum. And we kind of liked how this is actually something that Sohn himself might have done back in his day. In the Lake District, for our kind of a monument to the Ordnance Pavilion, we sampled the agricultural sheds in the area, but also took the symbols and the colours from the maps, and they can synthesize these to create a kind of 3D assemblage within the landscape. Accidentally, we also kind of referenced the men in tweed that you can see from the Ordnance survey when we built the pavilion in the landscape. Apart from we weren't as well dressed, I guess. In Poole, Dorset, a pottering shed, we have taken reference again from the kind of fishing huts in the area, but also the boat building that happened within this area. And even with the kind of ornament of the crustaceans that are gripping to the structure. But these also represent kind of the client's almost unhealthy love for seafood. And then finally, at James Street in Liverpool, where in response to the historic context, the elevations of the building synthesizes grand, heavy masonry architecture in the area into a checkerboard of rusticated stone textures and deep setbacks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both of you. So next we go to Katrina Stewart and Hugh McEwen of Office S&M.
Hi everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for inviting us to speak today. I'm Katrina, and somewhere on your screen you'll have Hugh. And together we founded Office S&M back in 2013. And so this is our current team of 4. And when we're not working from home, you'll be able to find us in Dalston. And here are just some examples of projects that we have been working on over the years. So we founded the practice in the years immediately after the 2008 crash. And we have been developing our work through 10 years of austerity in the UK now. Our approach is a response to the social, the cultural and the political conditions of today. Through a pluralistic architecture, we embrace pop culture, emerging trends and technological advances to produce architecture that is an experience. With each of our projects, we respond to the context, the house, the street and the neighbourhood, acknowledging the existing while deploying colour and narrative inventively to create drama.
We've also always worked with a 50-50 split of public and private clients. And so on the public side, this has seen us work on projects that range from public realm co-design through to food market fit out, which you can see here with Nag's Head Market. So onto the topic of multiform. So at Office S&M, we felt, you know, when looking at this, that austerity had kind of created a society that was risk averse, and where kind of background architecture had become the norm, and brick chic was celebrated, as Owen touched on earlier. And the main problem we had with this is that we feel that it's led to a kind of a lack of ambition, and it feels that planning authorities, politicians, you know, even royals use contextualism as this tool for kind of enforcing a certain conformity and a singular way of designing, and we think that, you know, that's not right. We think that kind of plurality should be allowed. So in our article, we presented kind of various tactics that we use in our work to tackle this sort of default thinking, and I think our approach was termed luxurious thrift, which I quite like, and we see this as a kind of opposition to austerity chic. So for an example of this kind of thrift, Janus House is covered in a spray-on finish, this spray-on polyurea skin, which was originally developed for oil rigs, and we chose this because of its low cost and the fact that it could be kind of, you know, seamlessly installed, and it would kind of contrast with the existing house. So the kind of the cost element was really sort of pushing this to make us use a very different material, but allowed us to create the new spaces which we needed and deliver this project.
So in all of our projects, we view waste material as being inherently valuable. And these ideas of a valuable waste are explored in this project called Motel House, which was a remodeling of a Victorian house in London. And this project was for a really interesting client who works within the sustainable fashion industry. She founded an online service that believes in lending fashion rather than consuming it. And these notions of borrowing and reuse were carried through in the materials and shapes that we explored within the project. We reused materials that had a story to tell, such as surfaces made from melted milk bottles, and terrazzo made from pulverized rubble to form these luxurious marbled worktops. Each piece of furniture is designed to have more than one function. So, for example, the bench that you'll see in the next slide to the left provides seating for the dining table, storage space above and below, and has a throne with a crown for the family to host guests. And so these multiple functions allow for each family member to find new uses for the furniture, and through this reinterpretation of the objects, its own lifespan is then extended.
So the third project we wanted to quickly show you was Salmon House, which is a new build-to-rent house that we designed as a study in generosity for its tenants and for the street that it sits on. So with more people renting privately, we wanted to kind of build flexibility into the project so that it could accommodate, you know, a variety of ways of living, even though it was this sort of speculative house, and give a kind of generosity to its occupants. But this generosity, you know, we needed to make sure that that wasn't going to come at a price, and that the house ended up being built for just over £200,000, which meant that the tenants pay, you know, standard market rents for a better quality of housing, and it's also very well insulated. So the tenants only pay £300 a year for heating and lighting. So it kind of creates this a better kind of quality through looking at these alternative ways of delivering something. And at the same time, even though it's rented, we wanted something that was unique. So we designed spaces that would be celebratory. So for example, the triple height spiral staircase, and through kind of applying these techniques and these tactics of opposing a kind of new London vernacular, we thought there was the opportunity for this project to become an improvement on its context rather than a copy.
And through our work, we propose a characterful, joyful, and colourful alternative to austerity chic. Each project is explored through a reappropriation, juxtaposition, and assemblage of different elements. While the work is born out of austerity, we believe it challenges the typical risk-averse, polite response to beige architecture. We see reuse as an essential design tool in a world where resources are finite. This is not a sacrifice, it is a luxury, and we believe more is with less.
Brilliant. Thank you, both of you, so much. Next, we go to Stephen Parnell, a senior lecturer here at the School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape at Newcastle University. Steve.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you see me? Even more important.
Not yet.
Not yet. Can you see that?
We can see your slides. So you'll appear, but we can see your slides.
Good. Started at the end. So I'm going to be talking, thank you for inviting me, by the way. I'm a historian rather than a practicing architect, so I won't be showing any of my work, but offering some thoughts on this reflection on multiform and postmodernism. So I'll be reading from my latest work, The Birth and Rebirth of a Modern Movement of a Movement. And think of it like an audiobook, but with slides. So for many architects, postmodernism was always a dirty word. Jenks's PhD supervisor, Rainer Banham, for example, famously called it building in drag, and AD's friendly rival, the Architectural Review, never accepted or legitimized it. After Andreas Papadakis sold his publishing house Academy to the German publisher VCH in 1991 and left at the end of the following year, and there's a story to be told, AD ploughed a new furrow with digital computation and Deleuzian theory. But postmodernism never disappeared completely. The boy band of architecture, fat or fashion architecture taste, was established in the mid-90s and became an antidote to good taste from the get-go. A number of small, fun, clever, and provocatively iconoclastic works appeared, culminating, from the media point of view at least, with AD's radical postmodernism issue a decade ago. Already a decade ago, wow. guest edited by Fatt and Jenks, alongside a new book by Jenks, also published by Wiley, which acquired AD in 1996, reflecting on the movement. So it was time for postmodernism itself to be historicized. Looking to the present, we might detect a certain stylistic similarities to the baby boomer strains of postmodernism from the 1980s, but the medium which Marshall McLuhan, of course, famously equated to the message, that the latest generation of postmodern protagonists use is social media. If mediation was a core strategy of modernism, postmodernism made it an art form. But if Jenks were promoting his movement today, it would be on Instagram rather than AD, enabling him to even more quickly update his bubble diagrams with his genius for categorization, rendered in hashtags rather than isms. Instagram is the natural home for Generation Y postmodernists, those who were born after the original movement and therefore were not immunized against it, like Fatt would have been. It is where influencers like artist and designer Adam Nathaniel Furman, with 42.1 thousand followers, so effectively promote their work. The legitimation rendered by the cultural capital bestowed upon work by a magazine like AD means less in the online world of likes and retweets, where a message or a meme can be sent around the world in seconds and go viral is considered a fleeting mark of success, like appearing on the cover of a magazine might once have been. A whole new taste regime emerges on Instagram, where facadism and surface are taken to the next level. Here you can find a nostalgia for Ettore Sotsas and the Memphis Group, for example, in the work of Camille Walala, 166,000 followers. Or Morag Myaskov, 43.6 thousand followers. Their sunny designs of primary colours and primitive shapes are unapologetically joyful, as are those of Yinka Ilori, 52.7 thousand followers, whose Dulwich Pavilion in London of 2019 was not so much functional as just fun. A more serious knowing humour based on historical reference can be found in architects like, as we've just seen, Studio Mutt, 5,000 followers, with their overscale dividers at the Ordnance Pavilion, as you've just seen, in England's Lake District National Park, that recalls Frank Gehry in LA, at least to me it does, of 1991 when I just started architecture. Or Space Popular, 10.4 thousand followers, it's 10.4K followers. Vault House in Valencia, which is reminiscent of Sterling's Stats Gallery of 1984 with its green frames. Space Popular also take Multiform beyond style, though, with their interest in integrating digital technology into physical space, such as in their Freestyle exhibition at the RIBA last year, which integrated virtual reality with physical models against a brightly patterned backdrop while questioning the whole concept of style. And to this collection, I'd like to add my erstwhile colleague at Newcastle, Hannah Benihud, an artist and architect working in London with 1.2K followers. This idea of multiform and its relationship with the digital brings me to thinking about its relationship with games, video game technology, such as the beguiling and enigmatic Monument Valley that was launched in 2014 and is a different kind of game. It's a very architectural and spatial game that is not about competing and blasting things out of space, but it's about exploring space in time. And this, of course, leads on to other games more recently, famously like Minecraft, the very blocky 8-bit reminiscent world-building game, and of course, Roblox, which my daughter is completely obsessed with at the moment. But I'll leave it there. Some thoughts on the digital and the social media side of what multiform and postmodernism might be today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Steve. There's lots to pick up there, I think, after the presentations and the questions. So now we are over to Matt Barnes of Cannes.
Hello. Let me share my screen a sec. So I trust you can see that. I'm not really going to talk much about what I've written in the AD, but it's more a comment on how I see our work in response to some of the other pieces I've read in there. So, as with many practicing architects, I've generally tried to avoid theorizing the work too much, and I've often pushed back at the term postmodernism, mainly because I see it as an almost historical style, considering that it started more than half a century ago. But I'm kind of into this idea of multiform because it allows flex, and just like ad hocism, it evolves with the cultural and historical context that surround each project. I thought some of the ideas on collage, assembly, and bricolage in Mario Carpo's piece, and in particular the ideas around Colin Rowe's Collision City, really echoed some of the approaches in Can's work, although instead of taking a citywide approach, this is more of a design approach for sort of individual buildings. So I've looked back at a couple of our projects and looked at how they realized themselves through a series of different collisions, as opposed to the normal architectural approach of hiding the inherent collisions with an homogeneous whole. So the first project is a small extension we did to a grade 2 listed townhouse in Highbury. I'd say this is probably the most homogenized collision. The clients wanted a contemporary glass box, but the conservation officer wanted a traditional Georgian extension. By using the glazing rhythms and ornamental finials of a Georgian glass house, but realizing them in standard steel sections, we collided the Georgian glass house with the Mesian box. The next project looks outside architecture and is basically a collection of disparate ideas and references all collided together. So each of the projects, I'd say, is a collision of different things. So this is reference collision. We have the mountain at the back, which references this mad fake mountain under construction in Disneyland. And then we have the perfect archetypal ruined wall, which is taken from this scene in Swanee's flat in Train Spotting. And then this fake fireplace plays on Le Corbusier's surrealist rooftop fireplace, which is probably his best design, in my opinion. There are many more references thrown in, and then it was just about how we arrange all of these ideas and making them work together with a plan and the sort of pragmatic things you need to think about in a house. So the next project goes back to architecture as reference and is a typology collision. So externally, Lomax Studio is presented as two separate buildings, but internally it kind of functions as one. So architecturally, this is collision between the industrial shed and then the more domestic scaled studio. This was done to both represent the opposing styles of the two artists' work, and also to break the mass up on the muse, as the rest of the buildings were much smaller in scale. And I'm going to finish on this as of yet unrealized project, which is a total remodel and reclad of a house in Hackney. This took the idea of being contextual to the extreme, and the facade is realized as a collection of architectural fragments which are taken from all the different styles and typologies on the street it sits. I don't know if anyone knows of the street Church Walk, but it runs from Stoke Newington Green all the way up to I think Clissold Parkway, and it goes through various stages of industrial to housing to total madness. So this house doesn't have its own identity, it merely magpies the identities of the surrounding buildings. And that's it from me.
Matt, thank you very much. So we're now going to Leah Catherine Jacka, who is the Assistant Professor at the University of Manchester. Leah Catherine.
Hi. Let me share. So now we will see if it works with okay. So thank you, Owen and Erin, for the invitation to take part. Oops, sorry, just trying to, okay. So now you should see only the slide, right?
Yep.
You see only the slide, not the notes. Okay. So thank you very much. And as same as Steve, I'm not an architect, I'm an historian. So I'm not going to talk about my work. I mean, I'm trained as an architect, but not practicing. I'm going to talk about other people's work and about the piece that I published in the issue, where I tried to read this idea of multiform as the next super cycle to come after postmodernism through the idea of media, and more particularly the media house, and how the media house has kind of evolved from the modernism to postmodernism to now. So my piece called Screen's Domesticity, from Postmodern House to Our House, obviously in reference to Tom Wolfe's famous book, questioned how the highly accelerated ubiquity of telematics and media technologies in recent years has changed us socially and domestically. So from the post-war era, of course, television had become the focal point in our home, and gathering people or gathering families in front of the screen and giving this kind of renewed idea of togetherness. But in the heyday of postmodernism, as I explained in the piece, the expansion of cable television with the arrival of Ted Turner's 24 hours news-based paid television channel CNN, and the year after, in 1981, with the arrival of the music video channel MTV, that modified, let's say, once again, our relationship between, or the relationship between screens and domesticity, because television ceased to be this single focal point, as you see in this image, in the home, but became instead transformed into a multiplicity of screens with no specific rhythm of programming, rather than a constant flow of media content privately consumed by individuals in different parts of the house. So actually, just a year after the arrival of CNN and MTV, the Italian architect and designer Ugo La Pietra realized this project called La Casa Telematica, which I thought was very interesting, and decided to research more for this piece. In this piece, so La Pietra transformed the traditional modernist media house into forms of postmodern domesticity. And it was actually a project that was initiated already a decade earlier in the famous exhibition New Domestic Landscape, Italy, New Domestic Landscape at MoMA, but he elaborated more here in '82. And in this project, La Pietra suggests a new sensory sphere in which the information and spectacle prevails, with the home, and the home is transformed into a theater where everyone was at the same time actor, spectator, and set designer. And in fact, the house itself, as you can see, transforms from this multiplication of screen, and also looks like a television set in itself. Television sets that adapts to the presence of these multiple television. So what I wanted to do in the issue was to sort of put this project in parallel with a contemporary project, which also questions the idea of the media and the house, that would be so the Multiform project, which is the project for the Van Room by Space Popular that was already mentioned earlier a few times. So Space Popular, obviously the office of Alara Leons and Frederick Elberg. And so this project of the Van Room is concerned with the future of virtual togetherness in the home. So how do we live not with one or many television screens, but with virtual reality. And so the Van Room speculates on the merging of one home with the other, leading to the creation of new spaces, literally a series of Van Rooms. So for Space Popular, the introduction of virtual portals in the home, such as television, computer, and smartphone, while having considerable consequences on our day-to-day existence, has, in contrast, left the architecture of the home mostly untouched. So with virtual reality, it would be this kind of overlapping, as you can see here, of different homes or of different spaces. So with the telematic house almost 40 years earlier, La Pietra had proposed that the media was detached from the body and the space took the aesthetic of the media itself, television and early computers. For VR, that would need to be more significant. There would need to be more significant transformation of the domestic space. And here's another image from the project, where you see again these complete overlapping of two space into one. And then to conclude, obviously now we cannot not think of the kind of situation we have now with media in the house. And while at the start of the 80s, televisions and computers were only beginning to invade and transform our domestic environment, today the media is ubiquitous and transcendental as our lives have abruptly been turned upside down by the outbreak of COVID-19, the omnipresence and embeddedness of screens in our house have transformed domestic and private environments into public spaces and theater of the everyday. So now more than ever, we live in media houses where screens are the ultimate mediator between inside and outside. And the real and the simulacra get superimposed, creating an advanced level of individualism that allow us to paradoxically live together. So yeah, I suggest that this would also, in the near future, probably create more of this condition of multiform. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we will be going to David Cohn Architects. But I just want to say before we do is that we are making good time. So there should be some time for questions from the audience. So if anything that you want to ask any of our contributors tonight comes up, please post something in the chat, and then we will deal with those once the presentations have finished. So just post in the chat and we will look at them in order. So a little bit of housekeeping. So now over to David.
Great, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Great, okay. Well, thanks very much for the invitation to contribute and to speak this evening. I'm going to talk a bit about the text that I wrote and the ideas in it. It goes back to some of the origins of the practice, which we established in 2007. But 10 years beforehand, I was spending quite a lot of my time photographing parts of the East Thames corridor. That was part of a project to document the very loose land uses that gathered unexpectedly, cheek by jowl, the image on the right there of Thurrock. So places for relaxation and escape next to industry and the Thames. And through the course of the essay, which I titled Perceiving Postmodernism, Learning from London's Marshlands, I took a journey along the Thames, picking up projects that perhaps connected to those initial visits. but built on this idea that landscape is a means to a much more open consideration of architecture as being generous and plural. And I suppose I then used a quote from Venturi's Scott Brown Eisenhower, learning from the existing landscape is a way of being revolutionary for an architect. The image on the left is a project that we did in 2012 of a one-room studio on the roof of the South Bank that was built for the Olympics. But I think crucially in the image is on the left, the view of the Savoy Hotel, which will come up again in a moment. So this idea of a landscape allowing a heterogeneity that perhaps architecture rejects is something that's cropped up repeatedly in these terms. And there was this sense that could this become an idea for a more central architecture, and these moments of pleasure encounter surrounded by these extreme juxtapositions of use is a really kind of radical urbanism, but one that isn't designed or taught in architecture schools historically. And this project, A Room for London, became an opportunity for writers in residence to stay aboard and talk about the site, the River Thames, and we used the project as a means to connect the site to the history of colonialism and writings about a very tragic part of London's history. And we invited writers in residence to document the experience. And so someone like Carol Phillips, sorry, go back a couple, how do I do that? Yeah. Carol Phillips wrote about the African diaspora and how the view from the boat would have been much more preferable had it been more like downriver. And so a building that we're doing at the moment that's on site very much tries to collect a lot of references to other things, other theories. But from here you can see some aspects of downriver. So for example, One Canary Wharf, which was perhaps the apotheosis of postmodernism. But the building itself is trying to connect to these different references from Venice, but also to try and make a building that has a humor to it, that, you know, this cartoon shows perhaps a wrong turn in postmodernism, which might have been contrasted to this moment, the National Gallery extension again by Venturi Scott Brown. And Denise Scott Brown has gone on in recent years to write more and more about her photography at the beginning of her career that inspired learning from Las Vegas, which was of these very heterogeneous landscapes that she found provocative, that led to learning from Las Vegas. So Las Vegas being meadows, I think a return to this idea that maybe by looking at landscape and the everyday, there is something radically progressive that we can bring back to the center. So thank you.
David, thank you very much. We now move to Christina Montero and David Knight, DKCM. So David and Christina. Hi, Christina.
Hi. We're both here. I think David is going to share the presentation. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having us today. We're really delighted to be part and included in this gang. We're going to show you two projects, a building and a strategy. DKCM uses multiple languages and multiple forms of practice to deliver mainly public projects. And we think that this multiplicity is necessary when we're working in and with and for the public. Engaging, listening, adapting, reusing, conserving are really central verbs to the way we practice. And this is an Edwardian public toilet in Bruce Grove in North London that's mainly underground, and it's listed, and it's been closed since the 1980s, and it's been in the Heritage at Risk Register for over a decade. A local community group had been advocating for the reuse of this building. And in 2018, the local authority commissioned us to work together to adapt and open the doors of this beautiful landmark building. This was an exciting brief for us because it needed an architectural response, but also a strategic one. And the local authority had no defined idea of what the building should be. We worked with them and with the community that originated, and also the community group that originated the project, to establish the idea that we're now delivering of a community cafe with social value that would both bring a local community use and access to much needed public conveniences. In parallel to these, we developed an architectural idea that would be significantly extend the ground floor use of and provide a kind of flexible multiple space that would literally unlock the site, and the extension was designed to read as something that learned from the railings rather than the pavilion itself. The project is a conservation one, which involved radically reimagining the building used whilst preserving and conserving its life as a survivor of a past era of municipality design. At the same time, the project had the chance to talk to the communities of Bruce Grove in new ways and learned deep lessons about the place. We ran a program that took multiple forums, but one that we really enjoyed was collaborating with Alex Adley-Jones, a documentary filmmaker working for over 15 years with BBC and Arena, to skill up primary school children on how to make documentary about their neighborhoods. And it was an heartbreaking and extraordinary experience. The stories that the children were able to collect as this process of learning what it is to be a documentary filmmaker really helped us set the scene and the clear social purpose that this building will have in its near future.
As we say in the essay in Multiform, we've learned from the work of many late 20th century popular and oral historians and community activists that the public at large should be protagonists of public projects. This is expressed by some people in our film People Talk Planning, which we showed at the British School at Rome a couple of years ago. This uses a series of pre-Zoom, I should add, Skype conversations with ordinary people, in inverted commas, about their experiences of the planning system. Such conversations are structural to our practice. Here's a strategic project that's also based on conversation. It's the Canal Placemaking study for the Old Oak and Park Royal Development Corporation. The canal at Old Oak is currently a bucolic waterway in the midst of industry, but when the work of the OPDC is complete, it will arguably be the most heavily used public space in this part of London. It's going to be under extraordinary pressure. It's the size of Green Park and already intensively used for commuting, for leisure, for ecology, and as a home. We hired a boat and organised a series of organised and impromptu conversations with local businesses, boaters, stakeholders. As usual in our work, we didn't just want opinions, but also ideas and offers. What could these organisations and these people offer the canal if empowered to do so? The tensions and creativities and complexities of these conversations led to a series of spatial principles that embody these tensions in what hopefully is a clear strategy, which is now in use and has been adopted. All of the principles are about achieving a balance between human activity, ecological richness and movement, built upon the premise of valuing existing qualities and uses in the context of massive change. Also, hopefully a super clear mooring strategy that should see not only the preservation of existing communities on the waterways, but also significant new ones. We're still working in Old Oak today, on the one hand delivering new canal access, a ramp that embodies the principles of this strategy, and on the other hand working with a group of young people of colour in the area to build bridges between the local planning team and its wider communities. The world between all of these projects that we've shown is our interpretation of Multiform. Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much, David and Christina. And we now have the final of the prepared contributions, Jeff Shearcroft and Tom Coward of AOC. So over to you both.
Hello, and thank you for inviting us to speak. We're delighted to be here. This photo shows a group of men, white men, standing around a table, speculating about what the future of architecture might be. One man is slightly older than the rest, Frank Lloyd Wright. You can see there with his hat, with his colleague brushing the model. What I love about this is that it's 1935, it's Broadacre City, but they're asking the question, what does democracy look like when it gets built? And we're interested in this question and how that's evolved over time. In 1928, women got to vote in this country. 50 years later, we had the first female prime minister, but it's clear from this photo that the other people, that the cabinet didn't necessarily represent the rest of the country. But we're very interested in this idea of representation and architecture, and how an architecture of democracy relies upon the forms of its representations. Margaret Thatcher came to power in 1979. In 1969, there was an act that actually meant that for the first time in the UK, we had a genuine democracy, one person, one vote, and all adults over 18. Now, it's surprising that it's only 50 years since we've had that. So one can see that actually there haven't been many big building projects since the true democracy. This is a photo of Milton Keynes shopping centre hosting the National Table Tennis Championships. On one level, it looks a very fantastic democratic notion, open, egalitarian, and yet you can see that this is very much built from the 1960s ideals of what a democracy might be. And these ideals very much still dominate today, the GLA, built by Foster, very much drawing on 60s ideals of openness and egalitarianism, but not necessarily thinking about accommodating full plurality of society. And we're committed to a social, cultural, and architectural pluralism. We're interested in this. And for an architecture of a meaningful democracy to take shape, it needs to reflect the needs of all its citizens. So it needs more deliberative forms of political engagement and more deliberative forms of architectural engagement. This is a project Shape Newham, where you can see in the middle Roxana Fias, Newham's mayor, at a workshop we organised along with Office, S&M and Carver Haggard, in which she is listening, she is engaging, and we are engaging. It's a very deliberative process rather than a top-down process. That's a kind of big political kind of evolution. This is more about us working between politics, between a big organisation, Southwark Council, and a local residents group, finding forms to support the different ways of coming together that democracy needs. And we're also interested in how these forms can permeate cultural institutions. This is a recreation of the cabinet table with a certain wig in the foreground from our favourite Prime Minister, showing how cultural organisations can embrace new forms that can allow new types of conversation.
We actively celebrate the quality of difference in the things that we help to make. As well as reflecting on the varied use of form and the capacity it gives, it is also worth considering process to acknowledge that there are many ways to bring together the parts of a project. There are rare opportunities when you are given a new brief, combining known types of experience into a hybrid. The reading room at the Wellcome Collection is a juxtaposition of library and museum designed for all ages and interests. On this project, the curators and the design team worked fluidly around a shifting shared sense of the collection and its value. The contrasting color and spatial arrangement help define permissions for the use of the visitor, supported through minimal interpretation and varied interactives. The participative design process with curators and users allowed the role of objects to be considered from a user perspective. These principles have been developed for the soon-to-open Heritage Centre and Walworth Library in Southwark, where the paper archive, object collection, book stack, and space definition combine to make potential for a richer visitor experience. This brings us to the ambition for broader participation in the design process, encouraging the contributions of others in briefing, design, production, and experience of the work. Lift New Parliament enabled a brief development with 30 groups across East London and design testing to support a broad programme of activity, which improved through the specifics of that design. The housing-led master plan at Nunhead included a community centre and public realm through a 10-year conversation with a changing community, Nunhead's Voice. A political lobbying group became a charity, now successfully running the Green as a community asset. Little Big House uses the custom build model to include individual needs within the cost model of market housing provision. An adaptive typology reveals the tension where work grounded in one set of cultural associations is capable of being adjusted by its users to suit their grand designs. And at the Museum of Childhood, the ambition is to transform a collection on childhood into a design incubator for London. We ran Open Studio for the 12 months as a way to calibrate the curation and visitor experience through the experience of live testing and prototyping.
So that's the what. That's the kind of how we might engage more meaningful democracy, but what do we get? At a Museum of Childhood, we're very much seeking to capture a joyful architecture, a generous architecture, in which content, decoration, and inhabitation have an equal status. Good Grief, Charlie Brown, very joyful exhibition, we think, but shows the fact that joy is a very ambiguous word that can both have good connotations and bad. The Charlie Brown isn't necessarily happy all the time, but at Peanuts, it's a joyful work. And here, the kind of playing around the copying of original content, the juxtaposition of visitor engagement and artist installation makes for a kind of intense collage, which we hope is joyful. Bouncing around through time, looking back, looking forward, Spa School works to bring together its grand Victorian dame next door, and then off in the distance, rather ugly sister of a 2007 sports hall, using a kind of generous architecture to pull the two together. Out in Shinfield, trying to work out how a figure in the landscape can bring joy to a simple barn erected for the community. And finally, at Somerset House, exploring how you can bring a collage of elements together, found elements, new interventions, work, artwork, but most crucially, content, a variety of contents gathered around a table to create a space for a new type of conversation, an architecture that might be truly representative of this genuine democracy. Very much.
Thank you, Tom and Jeff. Well, that brings us to the end of the presentations. Everyone is stuck to time, so we have a 15 minutes or so for some questions and discussion. I should point out, of course, that this is not all of the contributors to the AD, it's a lot of them, and I'm very grateful to them for taking part this evening. But the AD also featured a number of people already mentioned some of them. Yinkira Laurie, Mario Carpo, Jennifer Bonner, Camille Walala, and Dirk Summers also contributed to the Multiform issue. But of course, this is by no means the limit of Multiform. It's a sensibility that we see in the work of many different architects and across the board. So I promised to go to the audience questions, and we have a couple. But if you have any questions that occur to you, please put them into the chat. But the first question from Faith Hamilton was about virtual reality and what place that might have in architectural design and representation, especially in a post-COVID-19 world. I don't know if anyone wants to take that. I would put that to Steve Parnell, who's presentation, I think, probably got closest to the question of virtual reality. Is that one that you'd like to take, Steve?
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I can think about that. I think, you know, post-COVID or pre-COVID, I think virtual reality just is part of the architectural design world anyway. It's everyday practice now. Certainly in terms of design, I think what's going to be really interesting and what is increasingly happening is how virtual reality affects the real world and how the two are mixed. And I think we've seen that in a few of the talks today. And in the Zoom catastrophe of I'm alive, I'm not a cat, you know, where you have filters laid onto people. I think that's going to start being commonplace in everyday world, for better or for worse. It can be a force of good, it can be a force of evil as well. So we have to be aware of that. But I think what's interesting is how the digital technology, the so-called smart city, which isn't really smart, kind of becomes infected, and the networks through which we can connect to other people, but also to objects, is going to affect us. So that's, I think, what virtual reality is going to become very shortly, if it's not already. How does that relate to multiform, though? Maybe that's a question for someone else to pick up.
This is, it's hard to have a panel of this size when you're in person on a stage. When you're in Zoom, it's kind of impossible. But does anyone, any of our contributors, if you're able to put your hands up, want to add anything to what Steve just said? Because that was going to be my follow-up question: is how does virtual reality connect to multiform? I think there is a connection, but I'm not quite sure what it might be.
I would say that I don't know. I try and stay away from virtual reality as much as possible, because I think mainly because I don't know how to do it, but secondly because I think it's quite a dangerous, if it becomes more pervasive in everyday life, it's quite a dangerous thing to start replacing physical bricks and mortar with imagined worlds, where then the responsibility of the people supplying the housing, the buildings, the office, whatever, is to provide decent, good architecture. If it is shrouded in virtual reality, that responsibility may, you know, peter away. But that's just an initial take.
This is the next question is directed to Office S&M, and it's talking about how they use reappropriation, juxtaposition, assemblage in their work. And the question is, does a library of architectural historical forms or fragments play any part in their design process, a kind of personally collected library which one can consult to respond to complexity? I know the answer to this, but I'm going to let them answer for themselves. So Hugh and Katrina.
Who wants to go first? I suppose I would say we do, in terms of kind of a spatial understanding. And I think this is something that we've discussed, and actually links back into some of those ideas about, the virtual and the real. And I think we're really enamored by kind of the physical experience of spaces and sort of how that might, affect you and how you might experience them. And so I think that kind of, that muscle memory, that kind of spatial understanding is really, really crucial. But I think on the other hand, we're very wary of kind of, saying in some way that work is about reference or kind of quotation, things like that, because I think it's, it's never as clear as that. And I think that's kind of I think we find that a kind of tricky position. So yeah, I think it's kind of one of those, yes and no answers.
I think we do, just to kind of add to that, I suppose. I think, we're both avid collectors and, we do collect, pieces of architecture, we collect objects, we collect things that we find kind of interesting. But also we collect kind of narratives. And I think when we work on projects, we often look for stories, both in the kind of history, but also, stories that our clients bring, and kind of narratives that our clients bring to the mix. So I think it does, a lot of our projects end up being more a kind of collection of stories than perhaps a collection of physical references, maybe.
Brilliant, thank you. The next question is from Charles Holland, coming from beyond the grave, as he describes it, as we kind of featured the death of the practice that he co-directed, FAT, in the introduction, and the question is about content. And I think Charles is keen to ask this himself because he hasn't actually posted the question. So
Yeah.
Can we unmute Charles? Here, yes, thank you. Brilliant. Hi.
Yeah, that was deliberate, so I got to ask it myself. Yeah, I mean, obviously, as someone who's sort of implicated, or heavily implicated in the origins of some of this, and described variously as a sort of ghost at the feast or an aging or ex-boy band member, it's kind of hard to sort of comment neutrally. But I'm interested in a lot of the presentations. Whilst I really like a lot of the work, the presentations were mostly, these are some projects we've done, rather than this is why we've done them, especially in relation to sort of Multiform. And so I want to ask about content, really, because I think there's quite a lot of talk about tactics, maybe, about how one does things and how one deploys stuff, but maybe not about the stuff that's actually deployed. And I suppose I asked that in a way because I guess for FAT, the sort of content, the bits and pieces, whilst the sort of recombination of them was kind of interesting in a way, it was more perhaps what the bits did and said about, politics and class and taste. And so I guess my question is, why this content and why now? And beyond the how and the what, how it's sort of mixed and changed and reassembled, what is it about the content, the specific sort of stylistic tropes that is interesting or important?
That's a very interesting question. Thank you, Charles. Who wants to take that one?
I could have a stab at it, Charles.
Thanks, Dave.
I mean, I think one of the things I've been struck by after the invitation is to what degree the multiplicity in the work is geared towards its reception and what's to do with its production. And I suppose one thing about content might be, when I showed the project that we're doing in Greenwich, I showed the references, but in fact the references are quite secondary to the purpose that the building has, is to be an entrance building. It has this very generous, oversized entrance. It has a sign that's oversized, which is to do with its presence in front of a bus stop. There's a kind of effort to make a very fine and broad reference to context, to use, to legibility, to accessibility, to a diverse reading that maybe different people can see different purposes in the work. And that's driving the production. The reception is that it's highly referential. And I think that maybe that's one other way of trying to distinguish cause and effect and what content might be, and that maybe that a lot of the way that architecture can make a positive contribution to the urban landscape is around things to do with its use, rather than perhaps its purely its referential content, and that use nonetheless can also, in a multiplicity of ways, refer to other buildings, other histories. And I suppose the reason that we showed the A Room for London was that was a much broader set of references that I would hope that architecture going forward would be able to encapsulate, that I'm perhaps not so well informed about, but someone like Carol Phillips was.
Yeah, I think it's massively important, isn't it? And like Charles, that's you're kind of bang on with your point there. And I guess for us, maybe the format is an issue. So saying things within 5 minutes means that you're going to be fairly blasé about what you've achieved. But certainly the issue for us is actually speed. And we have very quick projects, which tend to be the things that we showed today, like a pavilion or a kind of an exhibition piece, which are fairly indulgent pieces of architecture or pieces of design. And then we have very slow projects which are taking years, which are things like a transformation of a bus station, and they're taking years because we are engaging with communities and with very complex levels of kind of client, and the content of that is massive and it's really important, but that project is just taking forever. But I think your point is, yeah, it's a really good point.
Charles, can I turn this around and ask you about content in your work? Because the fact that your audience rather on the panel is a slightly arbitrary thing. There's no reason why you shouldn't be talking about Multiform yourself. How does the content how does content feature in your work in relation to some of these tactics, of which there is a sort of commonality between some of the things that have been presented and certain aspects of how you work?
Yeah, it's a good question. Obviously, there is a commonality and lots of kind of common reference points. I guess it's in the sense that that they're sort of chosen, and that choosing is very deliberate, is important, apart from anything else. Not sort of not simply that one is combining things, but that those objects and pieces that you use say very particular things in the world, I guess, and are sort of deployed for the particular kind of communicative qualities they might have at that moment. So I think that suggests that they aren't necessarily a sort of family of forms that are sort of redeployed each time in slightly different ways, but they're much more kind of maybe, well, one would hope, maybe sort of critically engaged in the place that they're put. And I can see that's totally evident in a lot of the work that's been shown. And I there's another whole area which I think David and Christina were talking about, which is to do with certain kind of processes about how work happens and how it acts within a community, which I think is really important. So I guess if there's a sort of formal quality being pursued, it's not the sort of formal activity itself, but it's the things that come out of that and what they say when they go back into the community that's kind of really interesting. If that answers it in some way.
That sounds like a prompt for me to catch the ball, maybe more for us to catch the ball, maybe. And I think for us, like, I'm not quite sure what kind of practice we would have and do if we weren't working in the public sphere. I don't mean necessarily for public clients, but I mean in the public sphere. And for us, though some taste things line up, but never particularly neatly. What we've actually found, or what we're continuing to strive to do, is to find ways of speaking multiple languages at once, using multiple forms at once, as part of a kind of striving for relevance and as a striving to communicate in really complex places, which is why we think about you know, amazing popular historians like Raphael Samuel as much as, or more than, maybe we think of Charles Moore, say, for example, much as we love both of those individuals. So I think for us it's a sort of, and this isn't necessarily the case for everyone, nor should it be, but there's a sort of, it's a function of public work, really, for us.
I think we're sort of, you know, unlike the 60s, when we had a kind of a era of kind of top-down municipal kind of architects, we are in the 21st century, and obviously the kind of political landscape and the way we design and approach kind of designing communities is very different, and we're sort of really excited by the tools that we have been developing with communities to sort of to create a kind of public projects that aren't single voices, but they are the kind of result of multiple voices of diverse communities, of tension, of consensus amongst a kind of a polarized society that we all live in. And those sort of worlds are the worlds that we live in. And I think how our work manifests itself through form is like a process of constant dialogue with stakeholders that are there, stakeholders that we find, with stakeholders that become present, and architecture that talks and absorbs and that evolves is something that we're very interested in.
I think it kind of goes back to that point of that was raised at the beginning. I can't remember if it was by you, Owen, but one of the key messages of the Multiform edition is they're kind of taking the world as it exists. And I think a lot of the practices that are spoken tonight are like, actually the content is driven by those conversations that happen with the local communities, or actually the kind of maybe the conversations that happen in the office based on the context, the kind of physical and I guess metaphysical context. And the content is born out of that, rather than the flip side, which is starting with nothing and then just inventing what it is. I think that's the kind of key difference to, well, that's one of the things that I feel binds a lot of the people that have kind of talked tonight, which I think is a really important thing.
We are pretty much out of time, but I wanted to ask any of the contributors who haven't had an opportunity to say anything in the conversation part of this, if there's anything you want to add subsequent to what has been said, or what has not been said, what might be missing before we close things for this evening. No. Silence. So thank you everyone for a really, really wonderful evening and insight into all of your practices, and whether that's designers or as researchers and thinkers. It's been a real privilege. And of course, a quick plug for the AD itself. It is available from various online bookshops, not just Amazon. So please do dig into that. But please, I would usually say, please join me in thanking our contributors, but we'll do a virtual round of applause for everyone for a really fascinating and insightful evening. And this is not the end of Multiform. I think it is just the beginning. So thank you all very much.